Hey there, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive right into the fascinating psychology and, well, the structural dynamics behind workplace behavior. We often assume that people define right and wrong at work exactly the same way they do at home. But within the context of a work group, that is rarely the case. To understand why that happens, we really need to break down the anatomy of ethical decision-making.
Let's kick things off with a pretty visceral scenario. Imagine this. Steven, a college student, starts working at a fast food chain. The pay is fine, the schedule is super flexible, but the corporate culture, it's a total mess. Policies are completely ignored. So one day, Steven is watching his coworker, Julie, and she accidentally drops a meat patty right onto the greasy floor. Without even flinching, she picks it up, slaps it on a bun, wraps it up, and sends it out to a customer. No hesitation at all. Just business as usual.
Can you imagine? So when Steven finally builds up the courage to ask Julie why on earth she would serve floor food to a human being, she replies with this exact quote. She says, "What I don't know won't hurt me." And honestly, that brilliantly captures our central premise today. Personal ethics at home do not automatically translate to the workplace. When the culture is poor and the pressure is high, our internal compass can easily get scrambled.
So, how do we make sense of this? Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the ethical decision framework. Second, individual and organizational factors. Third, the role of opportunity. Fourth, normative considerations and ethics. And finally, principles, values, and justice. Let's get into it. Starting off with Section 1, the ethical decision framework. We're looking at the messy reality of how choices are actually made on the ground.
Let's move to the framework and see how this builds across 4 major steps. First up is ethical issue intensity. Essentially, this is ethical awareness. It's your ability to even perceive that an issue exists in the first place and then gauge its importance. Next, individual and organizational factors weigh in. Then comes opportunity, meaning are there barriers actually preventing bad behavior, or are there rewards quietly encouraging it? Ultimately, these 3 pillars combine to form our intentions, which dictates our final behavior. So it's not just a single choice, it's a continuous, dynamic flow.
Moving on to Section 2. Individual and organizational factors. Let's zoom out and look at what influences these choices.
Now, what's really interesting about the current U.S. labor force is this changing distribution by age. We are seeing a massive influx of Gen Z workers right now, and this is the most ethnically and racially diverse generation in history, bringing entirely new ethical perspectives to the workplace. Unlike previous generations, Gen Z is much more likely to form an opinion of a company based on its ethics, its business practices, and its social impact, rather than just, the quality of its products. It's a real game changer.
But beyond demographics, there's also this fascinating psychological concept called locus of control. Basically, this is how people view themselves in relation to power. Folks with an internal locus of control, they view themselves as masters of their own destiny. They believe they control events through their own effort, and the research shows they generally make more ethical choices. On the flip side, people with an external locus of control see themselves as just going with the flow of uncontrollable forces. They kind of believe fate is in the hands of the powerful people in their company, which, as you might guess, makes them way more susceptible to unethical pressures from a boss.
And speaking of bosses, that brings us to the influence of the organization itself. A perfect example of this is the crude oil case study. So crude oil brought in a new manager named Lee to boost their lagging sales. And sure, Lee got results, but his management style was incredibly toxic. He bullied underperforming employees, he played favorites, and he routinely publicly humiliated his staff. Employees like Amy were absolutely terrified to speak up because, previous whistleblowers had actually been demoted. It's a classic example of obedience to authority. A toxic corporate culture and a domineering boss can completely override an employee's personal moral compass, literally silencing them into submission.
Okay, Section 3, the role of opportunity. Let's look at the physical and structural conditions at play.
So opportunity relies on a lack of barriers or maybe the presence of misplaced rewards. Basically, without aggressive enforcement of the rules, people are going to test boundaries. And sometimes they test them to an absolutely absurd degree. Get this, $1.3 million. That is the exact value of fajita meat stolen by a single juvenile detention center employee in Texas over the course of 9 years. Yes, you heard that right, 9 years of fajita meat. Because there were no enforced checks and balances, the opportunity was just wide open, and a simple habit of theft snowballed into a $1 million crime.
And this brilliantly illustrates the rationalizations people use. When asked why they think it's okay to steal from their workplace, a staggering 24% of employees justify it by simply thinking,
hey, the company won't notice. Others claim they aren't paid enough, or they'll even blame a rude boss. When the immediate job context fails to put up barriers, employees use these justifications to wipe away their internal guilt. They shift their personal values to fit their bad decisions.
Section 4. Normative Considerations in Ethics. Let's shift gears to the ideal standard.
All right, so up to now, we've been looking at the messy reality of what is actually happening. Now, let's pivot to the normative approach. This is how organizational decision-makers should approach an ethical issue, based on ideals and institutional standards. And these strong normative structures, they don't just magically appear out of thin air. They rely heavily on real-world institutions to guide behavior. We're talking political institutions like government regulations, economic institutions that map out fair competition, and social institutions like family and education. All of these exert pressure on a company to establish a solid foundation of norms.
Which leads us to Section 5, Principles, Values, and Justice. How do companies actually build this foundation?
When building this normative foundation, we really have to look at universal principles. The philosopher John Rawls used this brilliant thought experiment called the Veil of Ignorance. He asked, how would you design society's rules if you had no idea what your future position in that society would be? You might emerge from the veil as a wealthy CEO, or you might emerge as a beggar on the street. Rawls argued that without knowing your social position, you would naturally design universally fair rules, like the Liberty Principle, which ensures equal basic rights, and the Difference Principle, which ensures actions don't harm the least advantaged members of society. These unbiased, universal principles form the absolute bedrock of true organizational justice.
And here's the crucial point. When a company genuinely embeds these ethical principles into its DNA, it isn't just a nice thing to do for society, it actually drives profitability. Take the outdoor retailer Patagonia, for instance. Back in 1996, driven entirely by their environmental mission, they switched their whole line to organic cotton. Now, this was significantly more expensive, and it really drove up their supply costs. But what happened? Well, because the clothing was more durable, and because the company proved to their customers that they could be trusted, consumer loyalty just skyrocketed. Ethics backed by real action turned out to be a massive competitive advantage.
But to achieve that kind of success, a company has to cleanly translate those big abstract normative principles into a concrete blueprint. We call these core values. Look at Marriott's 5 core values. Put people first, pursue excellence, embrace change, act with integrity, serve our world. These aren't just empty words painted on a break room wall. They are the enduring beliefs that dictate how Marriott manages its stakeholders and, importantly, sets boundaries for its employees. It acts as a clear, daily guide for making ethical decisions.
Because ultimately, understanding this framework of ethical decision-making is exactly what gives you the power to change it. We've seen how intense pressures, a lack of structural barriers, and toxic corporate cultures can totally warp human behavior. So I want to leave you with a provocative question to really examine your own locus of control at work. Are you actively shaping your corporate culture and standing up for your core values? Or are you just going with the flow, letting external forces dictate your actions and serving floor burgers? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time as we continue to decode the fascinating mechanics of our world.